We're going to move rather quickly this afternoon. We have 4 speakers, and we want to be able to leave some time at the end for questions. You've got hard copies of the presentations. We will also be posting this. BBG will be posting this on their website in the next couple days, so you'll be able to access the video as well. So if you want to take notes, great, but you'll also have a video copy here in the next couple days. We are pleased to be partnered with the Broadcasting Board of Governors as we continue our monthly series on topical research findings from various markets around the world. This effort is in support of BBG's mission to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. Today, we're taking a look at Russia's influence in its periphery. Is Russia winning the information war? Our discussion is very timely. Earlier this week, Secretary of Defense Ash Carter provided a list of top threats to U.S. national security, and Russia was at the top of the list. This morning's lead editorial in the New York Times raised questions about whether Russia is a top threat. Today, you'll hear from one of our nation's experts on the threat. Our first speaker this afternoon is retired Brigadier General Kevin Ryan, Director of Defense and Intelligence Projects at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. A career military officer, General Ryan served in air and missile defense, intelligence, and political military policy areas. He is the former U.S. Defense Attaché to Russia. In his last duty assignment, he was responsible for America's strategic war plans, policy, and international affairs, and coordinated Army policy in the domestic interagency and with foreign allies. Ryan was the founding director of the Belfer Center's U.S.-Russia Initiative to Prevent Nuclear Terrorism, where he continues to facilitate U.S.-Russian cooperation and lead the Elbe Group, which you'll hear a little bit more about today. General Ryan will be providing us with some context on the current relations between Russia and the West. Please join me in welcoming General Kevin Ryan.
Thanks very much, Chris. Appreciate it. That goes. I'm going to put this back on, so give me a second. See if Lloyd, I don't think I need you. Can you hear me now? Okay. First, I would like to thank BBG and Gallup for putting this together, and especially Chris and Jeff Trimble for being the senior guys from those organizations. I was asked to provide some context, as you mentioned, for a discussion about relations between Russia and the West. I'm going to do a little bit of reading so I go quickly enough here and get it all in. I want to divide my comments into 2 parts. One is to comment on what I call average Russian, based on my experiences in Russia, and the second is to comment on the security elites, based on feedback from a group called the Elbe Group, and I'll explain a little bit about them in just a moment. First, on the average Russian, it's hard to generalize. I'm not sure why the pictures are not coming up, Lloyd. Do you know? Anyway, first on average Russians. It's hard to generalize about an entire nation, just like it would be hard to say what a typical American is. But the question is, who are these people and what is their general character? I guess in a way that's really what Gallup is all about anyway. That's what you guys do here. And I know that many in the audience today already have a pretty good background in Russia and can provide their own insights, and I look forward to hearing those during the discussion phase. I spent much time in the Soviet Union and Russia at different periods over the last 36 years, and I want to offer my own assessment of how I understand the Russian. And whenever I say I'm going to tell you that I understand the Russians, I remember Averell Harriman, Ambassador Averell Harriman, who was with Russia many years. His warning was that there are 2 great lies that everyone who works with the Russians eventually tells. The first lie is, I understand the Russians, and the second lie is, vodka doesn't affect me. So hopefully we won't have to prove either of those 2 incorrect today. Maybe because I was from the Midwest. How many people are from the Midwest here? A few, you know. So maybe it was because I was from the Midwest that if we excuse the outlier populations of St. Petersburg and Moscow, I see many similarities between the average Russian and the American Midwest. Conservative, hardworking, respectful of authority, family, values, and so on oriented. When I was a student in Moscow in 1982, I lived in southwest Moscow suburbs. Russians there were trying to make ends meet, just like anyone else in the world, trying to keep food on the table, get a few of the good things for their kids and themselves, a new TV, a new car, maybe Western jeans, take a vacation, visit family. Family is and was and remains very important to Russians. Relationships between people are very important in general, maybe more so than there than here. In a society that's rife with corruption, it's all about who you know. When I traveled through Russia in the 1990s as head of the POW office in Moscow looking for missing Americans, I often ended up in towns where no American had ever set foot before. Russians there invited me into their homes. They had very little, but what they had, they shared with me, a stranger and an American. I would explain to them that I was looking for an American reportedly missing in their town, maybe buried in the cemetery. They would try to help. Every Russian has a story of a missing relative, most from World War II time, but also after, in the gulags. When I was training as an Army officer, I was told the reason for these many missing people, or the large numbers of deaths in Russian society, that Russians just didn't value life like us in the West. But these people would weep when they would tell me of a grandfather or uncle who went missing, often someone they had never met or met only briefly. They clearly valued life. They just lived in a different context than I did. While the U.S. could send a colonel like me halfway around the world looking for one American, there was no hope for them of finding their own family members in their own country. You know, Russians are an interesting mix of spiritualism, pessimism, and optimism. It is amazing that despite decades of state-enforced atheism, the Russian people emerged from the Cold War very spiritual. After the end of communism, many people turned to the church for structure and moral guidance. I met a guy on a train. He explained to me he was in the Komsomol in the Communist Party in the youth. And after the wall came down, the party went away, and he said, I need moral, ethical structures for my young boy, so I'm going to have him baptized in the Orthodox Church. And because I'm the father, I'm the leader, I'm going to get baptized too. And I said, well, that's fantastic. So then you became a Christian. And he said, well, I don't actually believe that Christ was God, and I'm pretty sure there's a God somewhere out there. So what we're seeing at the end of the Cold War, and at least into the 90s, is a people groping for spiritual answers, although they don't really know where to get them. These Russians are, any Russian or Greek Orthodox in the room? No, one or two. So only you guys are going to understand what I say here. The Orthodox Church puts a lot of emphasis on suffering as a way to stay connected to God, to go to heaven. In the West, it's all about, right, God's mercy, His love, and so on. And I'm not saying what is right and what is wrong, but the Orthodox values fit nicely with your average Russian's experience. Right? The Russians are accustomed to hardship. They expect that even when things are getting better, they might not. There was a collective farm leader who called all the workers together and said, comrades, for a long time now we have stood at the precipice, but today we take a step forward. That's a Russian joke. Russians have many sayings that express attitudes like this, things that are out of their control. What is destined cannot be avoided. Fortune and misfortune live in the same courtyard. My favorite Russian saying is, today may be worse than yesterday, but it's better than tomorrow. That's fate for a Russian, right? And yet these are the same Russians who think who have no control over their lives, think that they can change the course of rivers to make cotton grow in the desert. So when we think about the impact of sanctions on the Russian people, it's important to remember what is their recent history. I was in an old man's home in northern Russia in the 1990s, and he explained to me that he had worked all through the Soviet era, and I'll go back one. He had worked all through the Soviet era and had saved 50,000 rubles. And his children had grown up and moved to the big cities of Kiev and Minsk. And after the the wall came down and after the Soviet Union disappeared, his 50,000 rubles turned to $10. And his children ended up living in foreign countries. He couldn't afford to go visit them. So when today's Russians assess the impact of sanctions on their lives, they don't necessarily compare things to 2007, say, before the sanctions or before the last economic trouble, when the ruble was 30 to the dollar, but now it's 60 or 70 to the dollar. They benchmark against the rampant inflation of the 1990s, when the rate was 5,000 rubles to the dollar and salaries were often delayed for months. So to conclude about the average Russian, it is true, of course, that there are differences between Russians and Americans. But it's also true, I think, that Russians are much like us. And my rule of thumb over all my career is that when in doubt, proceed from the assumption that we are the same. But being the same doesn't mean we understand things the same way. Maybe you don't see eye to eye on everything with your parents or your children. And this is the case between us and the Russians. Now, I'll close my comments now with some feedback from people I'm calling the security elite, members of the Elbe Group. For the past 5 years, a small but high-level group of retired U.S. and Russian intelligence and military officers have been meeting to discuss sensitive U.S.-Russia relations. Our seventh and most recent meeting was in October, and our next meeting is this March. The group's called the Elbe Group, named after the meeting on the Elbe at the end of World War II, consists of 3- and 4-star generals from the military and intelligence services, former heads of the GRU and DIA, FSB. It includes officers from the CIA, Ministry of Interior, U.S. military, and so on. The group meets in third countries because, frankly, some of the members cannot or will not travel to each other's country. What do these men have in common? They're not academics or diplomats looking for a reset. They're hard-nosed patriots to their countries looking for security. They are former architects of wars in Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and Iraq. They have some of the biggest intelligence. They've run some of the biggest intelligence agencies in the world. And over the past 5 years, they've been meeting to try and resolve some of the most sensitive issues in our relationship. So what have they been telling us? During the past couple of meetings, here are some of the things the Russian side has told its American colleagues. First, Russia has to conclude that the U.S. and the European bloc and NATO are trying to dismantle the system of security that existed in the European theater. And by that, they said they specifically mean the Yalta Conference security system. They say that the U.S. is unwilling to see the erosion of its position as a superpower leader. They claim that the U.S. is creating crises around the world to preserve its superpower position, and they blame the United States specifically for the Arab Spring and all the color revolutions. It's actually a CIA plot. The U.S. and allies are preventing Russia to integrate within the post-Soviet space. And they again turn to the color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine. They see the increasing presence of NATO military force in Eastern Europe, especially the Baltics, as a direct threat to Russian security, and they say they, quote, will not tolerate it. They see in the Baltics the same conditions that exist in the Ukraine and have justified Russian actions there. And it's in this standoff in the Baltics that most concern members of the Elbe Group, both Russian and the U.S. When we think about scenarios that could lead to war, it is the Baltics that we think about. Since Crimea, the Elbe Group has been urging the two governments to create mechanisms to de-escalate the crisis in that region. So finally, what has the Elbe Group taught me about our ability to communicate with each other? First, I think there is little gap, no gap, between what Russian media is reporting and what Russian security experts believe. The propaganda that colors Russian media accounts of the situation between Russia and the West not only reflects what the government wants people to believe, but it reflects what people are already predisposed to believe. Good propaganda, for those of you who've worked with it, does not tell you something that is blatantly false or hard to believe. Good propaganda tells you something that you're already inclined to believe. Former GRU head General Korobelnikov is a good example of this. He's a member of the group. He has access to the internet. He does world travel. He has analysts with the best information Russia can gather, and yet he fundamentally does not see the situation as we see it. I don't see a security elite in Russia who quote, know one story or the true story, and yet are dedicated to propagating a false one. The second thing that I see about communication in Russian security elite is that the more open and honest that we are with each other in groups like the Elbe Group, the more we understand how really far apart we are. In March 2014, when the Elbe Group was meeting in Morocco, the whole thing with Crimea was blowing up. And during the breaks in between the meetings on other subjects, I would show the media broadcasts up on the screen. And the Americans and Russians sat there and watched the exact same video, the exact same reports, and came away with two different understandings of what was happening. So last week, Minister Lavrov gave me my final quote here. He said at his annual press conference, "Our Western colleagues sometimes say testily that there will be no business as usual with Russia. And I am certain that this is the case, and we agree with them on this point. Indeed, there will be no business as usual. The West had attempted to impose on us agreements that heeded primarily the interests of either the EU or the US, and sought to persuade us that this would not harm our interests. That old story is over. A new story is beginning that can only develop on the basis of equality and other principles of international law." Thanks very much.
Our second speaker this afternoon is my colleague Nelly Yesipova, Director of Research on Global Migration and Regional Director for the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Nelly spends a significant amount of time in the region. She was born in Russia, and she'll be sharing findings today from our Gallup World Poll. This is an initiative that we conduct in more than 160 countries around the world, some very topical items of interest today. Please join me in welcoming Nelly.
Hello. World events can trigger different level of interest in different countries. So, for example, some event can be closely followed by people in Russia, and at the same time there will be no interest to this particular event in some other former Soviet Union country. So it's really hard to measure effect of media on people's opinion about some particular event in many countries simultaneously. So, but with turmoil happening in Ukraine, we had a very unique opportunity to look at the effect of Russian and Western media on forming opinion about what's happening in Ukraine and Crimea. Right after 2014 referendum in Crimea, we were fielding our annual world poll. And we managed to ask questions about Western, Russian, and local country media, as well as support for Crimea joining Russia in 12 out of 15 former Soviet Union countries. Our first series of questions was about use of media. So this is our first question, which we ask. I would like to ask you about different sources of news about the event taking place in Ukraine and Crimea. Please tell me whether you think each of the following sources is a reliable or not reliable source for news about situation in Ukraine and Crimea. And if you do not use this news source, just say so. So this is for Russian media. The first thing you probably all notice already is that vast majority of people in all countries, with exception of Azerbaijan and Georgia, did use Russian media for coverage of Ukraine and Crimea events. And of those who use it, vast majority find Russian media reliable. Exceptions are Estonia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, where we did not see difference between reliable and not reliable groups. Identical question about Western media. First thing is that it's not a surprise, of course, but smaller percent of people use Western media. But what was alarming is that for people who use Western media, it wasn't very flattering for Western media. So there was only one country, Georgia, where first of all, actually, just few people use Western media, but of those who use it, high percent found it reliable. In the rest of the countries, it's not reliable. More people say not reliable. And in several countries, it was several times more people said not reliable than reliable. So it's not only in Russia, it's Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and so forth. We asked similar questions about local media in Russian and title language of the country, and results were similar to Russian media. And for those of you who are sociologists, before you start criticizing me, I will tell that we rotated the order. So all media was given equal chance to be asked about first. What was even less encouraging is that when we look at people who use both Russian media and Western media, what we found that only in Georgia, these people found Western media more reliable than Russian media. So green line is Russian media and black line is Western media. In the rest of the, look for example at Tajikistan, 36% of people felt like Western media is reliable and 85% that Russian media is reliable. And we ask all people in our sample about if they support or not Crimea joining Russia. And again, this was right after referendum, so everybody knew the results. So you can see that clear divide between, so we have 6 countries where vast majority said we support, and 6 countries which say do not support. And not surprisingly, on not support, more people say do not support. So like, of course, in Ukraine, only 4% said we support. But the rest of the countries are countries with territorial conflict in which Russia is or was involved. So Georgia, South Ossetia situation. Azerbaijan, it's actually was conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan about Nagorno-Karabakh, right? But Russia stood up on Armenian side. So what we see is 55% said of Armenians support and 10% of Azerbaijan people. Latvia, 212 kilometers of border with Russia. Estonia, 294 kilometers of border, and there is still not clear situation sometimes. And Moldova, Pridnestrovia situation. But the rest of the country support, highly support. And as a matter of fact, we asked exactly the same question this year in 2015, and what we saw is that percent of support either stays the same or increase. We did not see any decrease. So now we are going to interesting part of it. So what we saw is that if people, so the first line is total for the country, support for Crimea joining Russia. If people would watch only Russian media, then the percent would be slightly higher. But if they would watch also Western media, percent of people who support Crimea joining Russia went up. So what it means that actually Western media gave a great help to Russian government in forming positive opinion towards this situation. And another interesting thing about all this is that we had people who did not use any media. So if people did not use any media, then they were, in all countries, they were less likely to support Crimea joining Russia. Okay? And there were more surprises in our data. So in Russia, in Ukraine, when we look at demographics, people were united on their views in different way, of course, Russia and Ukraine, and there was no difference by demographics, right? So, I mean, like, how can it be different when it's 97% of the people? But in the rest of the country, what was interesting and what, for example, did not agree with my hypothesis was that what we found that in all countries, people who are highly educated, they are more likely to support Crimea joining Russia. Similarly, people in cities, in big cities, were more likely to support Crimea joining Russia than in rural area. And with education, with age, the difference was, well, slight difference for people who are older, they were more likely to support. But the countries where there is some conflict with Russia, then there was no difference by age. This was more obvious and counterintuitive. So we had 3 countries in the region in addition to Russia where there was a sizable number of Russians by nationality. So these people were more likely, Russians by nationality, they were more likely to support Crimea joining Russia. And one more question, provocative question we asked related to situation was the following. How likely it is that a situation similar to Crimea could happen in this country, in which a region of your country becomes part of Russia? Is it very likely, somewhat likely, not very likely, or not likely at all? And on the graph, you see the countries which have borders with Russia. So Georgia had the highest percent of people who said either very likely or someone likely. It's 53% total. The friendliest country with Russia, Belarus, they had only 10%. But you can see that in most of the countries, at least quarter of people believe that something like this could happen. And also take a look at volunteered response. Something like similar already happened in this country. And you can see 8% in Georgia, 8% in Azerbaijan, few percent in Estonia and Latvia. Back to our main topic. To conclude, what did we see? If the West wants to participate in forming opinion of people in this region, it will clearly need to make some changes in its communication strategy. And these changes has to be made not only in the content, but in the tone of how people present information, how West present information. Uniqueness of this region is that people in this region still has very strong ties with Russia. And Russian media knows its audience and knows how to appeal to this. So we did a lot of qualitative research with BBG and with World Poll. And what we learned in all these countries that many people feel that Russian coverage goes much deeper into the issues than Western media. And we are talking about Western media overall. We did not pick on any particular outlet. And the Western coverage come across as very disaffected. So it lacks passion and fail to demonstrate an understanding of the region. I personally have heard several times people telling the same phrase, I don't have to like Putin to love Russia. And I immigrated here 25 years ago and I'm still patriot of Russia, right? So people have to remember this, that you have to give something emotional, something warm to people and show that you like them. Some people, another quote, some people don't like Western media tone, which they said demonize the region. Okay? And they feel like the way it's presented, everything was presented, insulted their national pride. So, to conclude, in this round of information war, Russian media won. That's all. Thank you.
Our third speaker this afternoon is Mr. Jeffrey Trimble, the Deputy Director of the International Broadcasting Bureau. Trimble joined the BBG in 2007 as Director of Programming and later served as Executive Director, managing the board, staff, and providing strategic guidance and program oversight. Previously, Trimble served at U.S. News and World Report magazine for 15 years. During part of this time, he served as the Moscow Bureau Chief. He is a fluent Russian speaker, so we've got a whole panel of fluent Russian speakers today. Jeff will be talking with us about U.S. international media's approach. Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Trimble.
Thank you, Chris, very much. Unfortunately, something came up, and John Lansing, our CEO, who'd been scheduled to speak with you today, had to ask me to step in for him. And he's very sorry, and he sends his regards to this group. Lucky for me, though, because it's a great opportunity to visit the situation in Russia, which indeed is a place to which I've devoted so much of my career. Can I ask a question? Is Nellie's mic on? Because I'd like to ask her a question right now, just for clarification. Will folks be able to hear her if I ask her a question? Thanks. Nellie, just that's from my perspective, kind of a discouraging presentation you just did, but I want to clarify something. When people are talking about Western media, are they talking about the entire universe of Western media?
Yes.
They're not talking about international broadcasting
Absolutely.
per se.
Yes,
it's
yes.
Western media per se.
Absolutely. It was
Okay.
part of world poll, so we were not focusing on any particular broadcaster.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that clarification. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions around those issues when we get to the Q&A part. I also very much appreciated General Ryan talking about his background. I think I was in that same dormitory in southwest Moscow just a couple of years earlier than he on Ulitsa Volgina, studying at the Pushkin Institute. I was there in 1979, 80, and 81. So it's a pleasure to share the event today with someone who has that deep, rich background in Russia and the Soviet Union. A couple of points I'd like to make before I talk about what we do, and the first goes to the nature of the media environment in the world today and what we're confronting. I would submit to this group, and this isn't by any means an original thought, this is a astute group, and I'm sure you read these ideas from others, but I would submit for your consideration that the 21st century is seeing a new intensity and scale of media manipulation, psychological warfare, and disinformation. The technological capacity of the information age, the increasingly sophisticated use of media by authoritarian regimes, the advances in information war by Russia, China, ISIS, are throwing up new challenges from technical questions about the power of social media through to deeply philosophical issues about the nature of truth and reality. Information freedom, an underlying goal upon which nearly all Western international broadcasting is based, is front and center in discussions of information warfare. And I'd like at this point to say I don't care for the term information warfare. I don't like it because it senses a kind of an equivalence in what we're doing and what the Russians are doing. I prefer to refer to this as a war on information by the Russians. Think about that a little bit, and we can discuss it a little bit if you'd care to in the Q&A session. But what we're seeing is that while open media systems are crucial to democratic transition and governance, they are also susceptible to abuse by powerful external actors. And I think the person who's put this best is Vasily Gatov. How many of you know Vasily? He's a Russian media analyst, very astute student of the contemporary media scene, and he puts it this way. I'll read it out just for purposes of the recording. If the greatest battle of the 20th century was the battle for freedom of information and against censorship, then the battle in the 21st century will concern the abuse of freedom of information, the use of information as a weapon by authoritarian rulers, and non-state actors. There's a corollary to this, which is that the onslaught of information flows has pressed governments around the world to embrace greater information controls, or information sovereignty, as they might refer to it, in an effort to manage their domestic news space. So from the perspective of a non-democratic, weak, or transitioning government, something like the Arab Spring was a warning as to what can happen when domestic discontent is fused with powerful, uncontrolled information flows. And as ISIS, in particular, embraces new media platforms to coordinate and publicize their attacks, even Western governments today are struggling with the proper balance between information freedom and state security. As a result, today, global press freedom is at a 10-year low, with just 1 in 7 people around the world living in countries committed to robust protections for freedom of expression. And of course, I thank my colleagues and friends at Freedom House for the great work that they do each year in their study of media freedom around the world. So that's where we step in. Chris mentioned earlier our mission statement, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, U.S. International Media. We're dedicated to delivering objective, fact-based content across television, radio, and digital platforms worldwide. We accomplish this through 5 media companies. You can think of the BBG as kind of a holding company, if you will. Each of these companies has a distinct audience, approach, and role. Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, which is our Arabic language broadcaster, and Radio and TV Marti, which focus their programming on Cuba. John Lansing, who joined BBG as CEO last September, has laid out in his first months on the job 5 strategic priorities for the BBG moving forward. And you can read them here: aggressively pursuing a shift to digital platforms. I clarify there only that this is a market-driven shift. You don't go digital just for the sake of going digital. You do it in response to, and ideally to be ahead of, right on the wave of market forces. Second, enhancing the strategic cooperation across BBG entities. These 5 media companies working together are greater than the sum of their parts, and I think we're seeing some real fruits of those efforts, and I'm going to show you one of those products today. Third, enhance curation and acquisition of content. There's great content all over the world in many, many languages, and we're looking for opportunities to pull that content together, not content that we've created necessarily, and making it available to audiences in the 61 languages in which we broadcast. Fourth, to ensure impact by measuring progress and success, and that's part of the reason that we're here today. We deeply appreciate the work that's done by Gallup and by our research directors at the entities and their careful analysis of what's happening out there in our media markets. And finally, to target BBG resources to cover key spheres of influence, including those of China, Cuba, Iran, violent extremism across regions, and Russia. And by this, I don't mean the old political science definition of sphere of influence as in political control. I'm talking about information spaces in which these countries are concentrating their efforts in order to try to affect opinions. This shows the area that we're focusing our efforts in responding to Russia. To counter Russia and Russia's media efforts, U.S. international media is deploying a flexible, innovative, aggressive, multimedia effort aimed at Russians and Russian speakers in the former Soviet Union, Europe, and around the world. A really key element of this, and this will really resonate, I think, with those of you who had experience with Cold War broadcasting, is our emphasis on what we call global Russian. This is an effort to reach Russian speakers anywhere that they are on the face of the earth. This could be people who use Russian as a first language, or people who are fluent and comfortable enough in Russian as a second language to seek out news and information in the Russian language. And I think Paul has some things, you'll see some things in Paul's presentation that go directly to this point. Differs from the Cold War model in that, particularly in the latter part of the Cold War in the old days, the emphasis was on the vernacular languages of the countries to which we broadcast, and there was not dedicated Russian language programming for those countries. Frankly, I think we missed an opportunity, and important audiences by taking this approach, but we're addressing this very aggressively in our response to what the Russians are doing now. And I would just say that the efforts in the Russian language are by no means at the expense of vernacular programming. We're also strengthening unique and complementary programming in the vernacular languages. And in fact, we're drawing from original reporting in the vernacular languages to strengthen our Russian language global content, as well as content that we put out in our other broadcast languages, including in English. In particular, in this Russian market, we're focusing programming to reach strategic audiences, expanding partnerships to reach audiences in local markets and inform the news agenda in those markets. We are moving resources to digital platforms to directly engage audiences. We're increasing our research to better understand audiences and impact. And finally, we're utilizing our agency's capabilities and expertise to meet other needs. This gets at the non-journalistic work that's done by our agency. In particular, I'm referring to technical support that we've supplied as the federal agency, not as journalists. That's an entirely separate function to help Ukraine get transmissions into areas where their domestic media cannot reach because they're occupied by Russians and media are under control of Russian or pro-Russian forces. Since the fall of the Yanukovych government in Ukraine in February 2014 and Russia's ensuing aggression in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, BBG language services at Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty have added or expanded more than 35 new programs on multiple media platforms in Russian, Ukrainian, and other languages to reach new audiences in Ukraine, Russia, elsewhere in the former Soviet space, and around the world. The program about which you might have heard something, and it's featured right here, and I'm about to play you a clip of it after I talk for just another moment, is Current Time, which for those of you, how many Russian speakers here? Show of hands, please. Is a little bit of a play on words. You know, we all grew up watching Vremya, Time, as the main news program. Nastoyashaya, for those of you who don't speak Russian, has sort of a double meaning in this case. It means current, it means right now. It also means the real thing, as in legitimate. So this is like the real deal time. So there is a little bit of attitude in just even the name of this program, not to mention the way that it's executed. So in October of 2014, and this gets at greater collaboration, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty and Voice of America, working together in an unprecedented manner, launched the program Current Time. It's a joint pub production undertaken in partnership, and this is extremely important, in partnership with public and private broadcasters around the world, primarily across the former Soviet space. The show presents a daily 30-minute mix of live news coverage, interviews, original features, political satire, and it provides an alternative narrative to that which is propagated by Russian-controlled TV. At this time, the show's on the air in 9 countries through 25 media outlets, and it's available to digital audiences worldwide. The original Current Time program for the European part of the Soviet Union airs in Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Lithuania, and Latvia. Segments of the Current Time program are also carried by Israel's Channel 9 in Israel. Expanding the program after its launched, we launched weekend editions of Current Time with VOA doing the Saturday program, RFERL the Sunday program. And then in September of 2015, RFERL produced, using content from the original Current Time program, but adding original content, a Central Asia version of the Current Time program. The show, produced by RFERL, including VOA reports, is on domestic stations in Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan. To my knowledge, it's the first time U.S. international media ever has been able to pace programming in domestic outlets in Tajikistan. There had been some programming in Kazakhstan at one time, and Kyrgyzstan is a relatively open market for us. But it doesn't stop with the television program, and this gets at the nature of modern media, and this is absolutely crucial for our future success, in that the Current Time brand is continuing to expand through social-driven media, digital reporting, and engagement, a service at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty called Digim, which was launched at the end of FY fiscal year 2015 and is tasked with disseminating and producing cross-platform digital content, promoting the current time brand in the digital space, and engaging Russian language audiences on social media. Digim includes 4 operational units. These are all Russian language focused. A social media unit, which generates social media content and promotes U.S. international media content targeted across social media platforms. A mobile video unit, which takes content produced from RFERL, VOA, and other sources and curates this content from social media outlets, repackaging it into digestible form for distribution on social and mobile, in particular, outlets. The team is making unprecedented social media-friendly videos for the Russian-speaking market and also runs mobile video apps. The third unit is called Footage versus Footage. It's a regular video product produced under the Current Time label, which makes the audience the fact checker, if you will, juxtaposing video reports produced by pro-Kremlin media outlets with those distributed by Western and other media outlets on the same events, and letting the media consumers then draw their own conclusions about these. Satire is the fourth element that's really still under development by RFERL, but they are working on satirical programming to also introduce to these markets. So that's a very, very quick overview of the Current Time brand. There's quite a lot more that's being done. As I said, 35 new programs or content specifically since then, and I'm going to leave you, if this click works. I'm smiling back at Lloyd in the back. I'm going to just open, I'm not even really sure what it is. This is the opening of last night's Current Time program. The program is filmed live to tape at 10:30 in the morning Washington time, 4:30 in the afternoon Prague time, and then immediately sent out to the media outlets who put it on at different times during the evening. So this should be the opening of last night's program.
Здравствуйте, в эфире «Настоящее время» из студии в Вашингтоне. С вами Игорь Тихоненко. Сегодня главное в программе. Кризис в украинской политике. Министр экономического развития уходит в отставку и обвиняет соратников президента в коррупции. Жизнь в приграничных районах Южной Осетии. Специальный репортаж «Настоящего времени». И насколько реально так широко рекламируемая популярность Владимира Путина среди россиян. Американские социологи провели независимое расследование. По традиции мы начинаем с новостей из Праги. Сергей, пожалуйста.
Спасибо, Игорь. События дня в настоящем времени из Праги. Я Сергей Дорофеев. Здравствуйте. Министр экономического развития и торговли Украины Айварас Абрамович.
Primarily what you get out of the Prague anchoring, consistent with RFERL's surrogate mission, is reporting focused on events in the region, and what you get from the Voice of America anchor and reporting from Washington is international coverage of the United States, things such as the American presidential campaign, in which there's quite a great interest around the world at this time. And I note somewhat ironically that our two anchors last night both are Belarusian, so there you have it. So it's a real international effort. I think that's it. I look forward to question and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Our final speaker today is Mr. Paul Tibbets, the Director of Market Insight and Evaluation for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Paul wins the award for the longest travel today. Paul's actually based in Prague, in the Czech Republic, so we're very fortunate to have Paul with us today. Paul has spent a lot of time in the region, traveling around. I think he's visited every country in the region. And he's going to be providing some perspectives for us today on the role of Russian media in the Baltics and Moldova. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Paul Tibbets.
Good afternoon. Jeff gave you a really good overview of the Current Time program. This small piece of research that I'll be talking with you about this afternoon was developed to help support the launch of Current Time. When RFERL was going back into the Baltic states. We hadn't done any research on the ground since 2002, when the closure of our Baltic language services was first announced. So it had been a long time since we had been in the area. And we just wanted to put together some basic demographic information. If we were going to be producing a program in Russian, targeting Russian speakers in the Baltics, how many were left? How many people still spoke Russian? We got some data out of the statistical yearbooks, but we wanted to check for ourselves how well people spoke. We had some general numbers, but in terms of targeting, understanding who it was that may even tune into this show, we needed to go back on the ground. Hadn't been in Moldova in a while. We were there last in 2010. So same sort of idea of who's still speaking Russian, how are they using the language. And while we were there, we gave ourselves one additional task, which was to look at how are people consuming Russian language media. And in this part of the former Soviet Union, it gets quite complicated because you can have media in the Russian language that are produced locally, as well as Russian language media coming in from the Russian Federation. And so if I have some of these linguistic gymnastics, I apologize in advance, but we were trying to be careful in terms of not lumping all Russian language media into the same basket, but trying to look at the impact and effect of Russian Federation media on some of our target audiences in the Baltics and Moldova. So if we look at who still speaks Russian in the area, the majority of Russian speakers are not ethnic Russians. They're people who, from the Soviet days, from growing up around Russian speakers, they're Moldovans, they're Estonians, they're Latvians. So Russian's still very widely spoken, so good news for us. We had a good target audience throughout the region. And as we defined Russian speakers, for us as a media organization, they're people who would understand most or all of a radio broadcast in Russian. So Russian's still very widely spoken in Moldova. Large ethnic Russian communities in both Estonia and Latvia. Lithuania, levels of Russian being a little bit lower, always historically a very small ethnic Russian community there, but still about 6 in 10 speaking Russian quite well. If we look at the demographics, for those of you who follow the region, this isn't going to be terribly surprising. In the Baltics in particular, Russian speakers tended to be older. This is an influence of the Soviet period, learning Russian in school. In Moldova, and Moldova is the outlier in a lot of these slides coming up, the Russian language knowledge is much better distributed throughout the population. And in the Baltics, we saw that a lot of the Russian speakers tended to be more rural. They weren't necessarily as likely to be in the urban area. So this slide looks at the same information in 2 different ways, which now we're moving into not just Russian language skills, but using Russian language media and how significant was Russian language media for populations in these countries. In the left side, the light tan bars, we're looking at the general population numbers, and then among Russian speakers. So not all Russian speakers are necessarily consuming media in Russian. And the Lithuanians really trailing compared to the other 3 republics. Which platforms? We're coming in with a new TV show, but we've got the website, as Jeff mentioned. Which platforms are people using? And media usage in the Baltics in particular really being concentrated on television, which I think for us may be good because we're producing a TV show, a little bit problematic because of the control on the message on television stations originating in the Russian Federation. So we'll get into some of the messaging aspects. In Moldova, much more diversity in terms of how Moldovans are consuming different platforms to get their news and information in Russian. So we also asked some qualitative questions on these studies in terms of how important different media were to help people form their opinion on current events. Obviously, domestic media, not surprising, was most important to the populations in all of the countries, followed by Russian Federation media, and then what we lumped into the basket as non-Russian Federation international media, which trails in all 4 of the countries. Then if we're looking at trustworthiness, so not only are they just consuming media, but how do they evaluate the trustworthiness among users of that media? We see higher reliance on domestic media, less great deal or somewhat level of trustworthiness in Russian Federation media in the Baltics, and then among users of international media, higher level of trust in international media. Moldova is a little bit of a mess in the sense that they're not really trusting in any media across the board, be it their own, be it from outside, be it international. There's a high level of skepticism of media in Moldova. So one of the questions that we were looking at when we did the research is, I think when you see Western analysis of what's happening with consumption of Russian Federation media is, oh, people are watching Russian Federation television, so they must be influenced by the Kremlin agenda. And we assume that it's not quite that easy. There are lots of reasons why people watch Periphery canal, of why you would watch Russian Federation television. It may be for entertainment, it may be for movies, it may be for lots of other reasons. It may be because you want to follow the news and information agenda. So the one correlation that we found in our data was people who used media from the Russian Federation and trusted media from the Russian Federation generally had higher levels of support for Russian Federation policies. Everyone who was included in the study were asked about their levels of support on 3 topics: Russia's actions in Ukraine, the domestic policies of Russian President Vladimir Putin, and Putin's international policies. And I'll just go through quickly the levels of response that we had because they're not terribly surprising. Baltics separate again from Moldova. So as I said, we found a correlation with using and trusting Russian media, Russian Federation media, as individuals who had higher level of support for Russia's actions in Ukraine across all 3 of the Baltic republics, also higher levels of support for Putin's democratic policies, again across all 3 Baltic republics, as well as the international policies. Not statistically significant differences in terms of those levels of support, which is why I moved through all 3 quite quickly. Moldova tends to be a slightly different picture because you don't even need to consume media from the Russian Federation to be supportive of the actions of Russia in its periphery. Where you see lower levels of support are people who use and do not trust Russian media. So in Moldova, there was a difference here from the Baltics in terms of levels of support among non-users of Russian Federation media was very similar to those who trusted Russian Federation media. So we tried to quantify in one way or another what is the level of support in these 4 countries for the Russian Federation media agenda. Moldova and Estonia, you've got about 3 in 10, about 1 in 3 in Latvia who say that they use and trust Russian Federation media. So I think this is something that we'll definitely be following up on as we do more research in the area. Lower levels of trust in Lithuania, but just a reminder on Moldova, you've got 3 in 10 who use and trust Russian Federation media. You've got another 3 in 10 who don't even use Russian Federation media, but still support the actions that we asked about in terms of Russia and Ukraine, Putin's democratic policies. Moldova is, schizophrenic is too negative, but definitely very split in terms of about half the population being pro-European and half the population being pro-Russia. So we're not terribly surprised by the high levels of support there.
Does your Moldova data include Transnistria?
It does not.
Okay.
It is Moldova proper.
Okay.
So in terms of levels of trust, obviously ethnicity plays a very significant role here. By the titular ethnicity, I mean Estonians and ethnic Estonians in Estonia, ethnic Latvians in Latvia. So In terms of trusting media from the Russian Federation, there are higher levels of trust among ethnic Russians who are resident in the Baltic states, as well as people of other nationalities compared to Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians. Again, Moldova, the level of trust is just much lower for any media. Russians there are not representative just because we didn't have enough Russians in the sample for a statistically significant opinion there. But ethnicity is really the only clear difference. We didn't see major differences in terms of age or gender. There were no statistically significant differences there. Across all four republics, you can see a slightly older skew in Latvia. And also, I think what's interesting and something I'd want to look a little bit more at are younger ethnic Russians in Estonia. Which is pretty striking given the fact that that's just a smaller group overall, but having these high levels of trust in Russian Federation media. And so for us, something that we would suggest moving forward is it's not obviously just consumption of Russian Federation media, but that trust in Russian Federation media seems to be more significant in terms of supporting the content than just watching it. But we did note that most consumers of Russian Federation media place a lower level of trust in it than did consumers of international media. But we did acknowledge that usage of international media was much lower. And so looking for us in terms of what could be done to increase international media usage and trying to understand more about why international media isn't being used as much as media from the Russian Federation. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. We've got some time for questions. I've got two of my colleagues here with mics. If you just raise your hand, state your name and organization. Right there in the back.
Diana Belchase, Booksmart TV. I was just wondering, Ms. Espova and Mr. Tibbets had different outcomes with their research. I'm wondering what the size of your cohort sample was, because I see an appendix here from Mr. Tibble. The other question I wanted to know is from Mr. Trimble and Mr. Tibbets, how many of your programs are in English? Thank you.
Nellie, you want to start?
World poll, we collect 1,000 interviews with adults 15 years plus in each country. In Russia, our sample size is 2,000. I wouldn't say that our results are so different because, first of all, it's hard to compare because we were talking specifically about Crimea situation, right? We just pulled one particular situation, while what Paul was showing, it was more broad, right? And another thing, if you remember my slides, so I didn't have Lithuania, and I didn't have Latvia with media question. So we had only Moldova and Estonia, and those two countries didn't have great results for Russia either.
And for us, in terms of the methodology, you've got the numbers and the fieldwork dates, but similar sample sizes of about 1,000 respondents in each of the four countries. And Nellie hit the main points in terms of we had included a couple of countries that were Latvia and Lithuania that were not included in all of Nellie's data. And also the questions being slightly different. But thank you for your question. It was something that I had noticed as we were running through our slides and putting the deck together that we did have a slight difference of opinion there. And there's not a lot that I can say on it. Basically, we presented all of the data we had. This wasn't a full BBG national study. This was a very specific set of questions that we asked on these topics. And certainly that provided some food for thought and things that we'll follow up on, but not nothing too definitive that I can say in terms of why it was A and not B.
Thanks for your question about English language programming. The Voice of America, I'm not sure am I on? Sorry about that. Yeah, hello?
Hold on just a second, Jeff.
Thank you. The Voice of America generates a wide range of English language content in all formats. I can't give you a number of programs because, again, increasingly as global media is a digital play, you're not doing targeted specific programs of a certain length. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the other broadcasters do English language content as well. There is not at this time targeted to the former Soviet space specific English language content. There's global content about the events in those regions. There is one little exception here, which is that the Voice of America has a very rich tradition of teaching English. And teaching English content is being provided at the request of media outlets in some of the countries of the former Soviet space. And Voice of America is developing right now a partnership with Ukraine because the President Poroshenko has designated 2016 as Go Global, the year of learning English in Ukraine. And so Voice of America is working specifically on creating English language teaching content that would be relevant for the Ukrainian market.
I think in terms of RFERL, English is not one of our broadcast languages. So what we produce in English for our English language website are repositioned. We do have a central newsroom that produces stories in English for the rest of the house. And so some of those materials are repositioned for interested audiences looking at consuming content in English. Through the years, back to the Munich days, we did have a full research institute that was producing research pieces. And as time has gone on, it's repositioned itself in terms of the website and social media effort, but we aren't producing programming in English.
I'll just take one more second on this to say that one of the things the broadcasters are doing, I believe, increasingly well, is taking this content that originates in vernacular languages of the broadcast region and purposing that content in English to reach global audiences. So a story that might start in Chechnya, in Chechen, by RFERL's North Caucasus service, first gets lifted up and done in Russian to reach audiences that would speak Russian, and then gets purposed into English. And RFERL, by the way, has a partnership with The Guardian. So The Guardian picks up that coverage from RFERL, and so if you look at The Guardian, you're seeing that coverage. And I was in a Nordic country last week, and people there were commenting on RFERL coverage of events in Russia that they were reading in The Guardian from England. So welcome to the modern world of digital platforms and the way information moves around. English is a terrifically important way to reach audiences all around the world.
Okay. Down front here. In the light blue shirt.
Hi, thanks. Dean Jackson, National Endowment for Democracy. I was sort of struck by your comment that trust in Russian media correlates with support for Russian policies. And I didn't find that so surprising, but what I thought would be really interesting is if you had any information on what factors determine or predict trust in Russian media. It sort of matches up with Ms. Esipova's observation that among people who use both Western and Russian media, they trust the Russian media more. And that seems to me to be the really interesting question. What leads people to trust in that media? Thank you.
Sure. It's an interesting question that I look forward to spending some more time trying to explore, because on the omnibus questionnaires, it was just, what we use in our standard national surveys of, do you trust a great deal? Do you trust somewhat? Do you distrust somewhat? And when we've tried to explore, we've done quite a bit of qualitative work recently to support Current Time as well. I was in Chisinau in December, and talking with individuals about why do you trust a particular media source. It's not something we get very rich feedback from focus group participants on. It's not quite how people think about it. I watch it because it's on, it's accessible, it's part of my media diet, everybody else watches it. There's not quite that intellectual step in terms of, I trust this media source, but I don't trust this media source. I think, what we saw particularly in Moldova, and it was reflected in the data, were a lot of quotes about, I don't really trust anybody, and so I just consume a lot of different sources. And they're not necessarily comparing the trustworthiness of the sources, but there's a lot of crowdsourcing that happens in terms of just pulling together a sheer number of sources, and from those sources, then I make up my opinion. And the internet's been fantastic for that. And some of the discussions we had with our fieldwork coordinator about their views is, you see people believing that they're getting objective information because of the number of sources that they contact, although objectively people would say the sources that they're throwing into that bucket really are not terribly objective. But it's just the sheer number and sort of the crowdsourcing that gives individuals the opinion that they're well-informed and are able to make informed decisions.
Paul, is there anything related to, certainly we've seen some reports, you and I've seen some reports on RT they have a short list of actual content and they repeat it over and over and drill in. Is there anything that might be
I think where we see them being more effective, particularly when you have individuals who consume a lot of different media sources, they're not spending a great deal of time with any one source of information. So it's sort of the salad bar approach of picking up a little bit from here and a little bit from there, and I'll mix it together. I think where you see RT being successful, and there definitely was discussion of, current time, that you're positioning yourself against RT, was around the war on information of you can't really know what happened. Part of what people had watched at home to prepare for the focus groups was around the downing of the Malaysian Airlines plane over Ukraine. And there was so much disinformation and so many theories that were publicized so widely, and so you had both VOA and RL trying to say, okay, the report's been released, and here's recreations, and this is what the experts in the Netherlands think have happened, and people saying, well, but what about this, and what about this, and what about this? And there's this plethora, thank you, noise, this plethora of information out there, and I think that's what we're finding to be really difficult.
Okay. How about right here?
Hi, Tanya Cooper, Human Rights Watch. I work on Russia and the Baltics. And last year I was in the Baltics talking about human rights situation there, because Human Rights Watch hasn't worked on these countries in a very, very long time. And what I found is that there's a huge divide that's caused by Russian television, Russian media that comes from Russia in the local communities, and especially human rights communities. And some Estonian human rights activists were actually telling me, what Ukrainians are doing is the right thing. They want to ban Russian television, they want to ban Russian media in the country, and that's what we need to do. Which I found extremely bizarre and odd and all kinds of wrong coming from a human rights person. So I'd like to ask the panelists, what are the kind of lessons learned from the Ukraine situation that we can apply in the Baltics and maybe do something different?
I think in terms of what we're looking at in Ukraine is a fairly significant shift, at least for us as an organization, that the Ukrainian service at RFERL always traditionally broadcast in Ukrainian. And they addressed populations in Ukrainian, and in the last 18 months have relaxed that position to a certain extent, and for targeted programming to Crimea, targeted programming to Donbass, those are places where people tend to speak Russian, do not tend to speak Ukrainian. And so, we'll go in with the moderators speaking Russian and engaging with those audiences in the languages that they speak. It's a strategy that I think historically comes out of RFERL from the wars in the Balkans and starting the Balkan service in the 90s, of not allowing hate speech, but allowing people to speak the way that they speak, and allowing the information. The main focus for us is the exchange of the information. We understand everybody typically understands the other language. And then just responding very quickly in the media that people use. What we added after the fall of the Yanukovych government was web and TV. And we had a lot of success during the protests on Maidan with live streams of the protest. And the Ukrainian service was really able to get going very quickly. But then we saw ourselves surpassed by Hromadske and Expresso TV, these internet TV stations that suddenly were doing a much better job than we were and were much faster. And so we focused our resources to doing something else and supported them in their activities, realizing that events on the ground just kept changing. In terms of banning media outlets, current time is on the air in Latvia and Lithuania. We have not been able to find a partner in Estonia. The Estonians are deciding to really pursue their own strategy. They've created their own Russian language public broadcaster. So we'll see how successful they are. I mean, I'm interested in measuring to see what the audience looks like. I was surprised because we haven't been in the Baltics for such a long time, as I talked about. There's still very good legacy audiences there for our Russian service, which really focuses almost exclusively on the Russian Federation. There's not a lot of coverage of the Baltics. But we still have good audiences. There's decent distribution in all three countries. So while Current Time has done very well in Latvia and Lithuania by being on TV, we've still got a lot of people listening to the Russian service in Estonia. So we'll see what sort of media strategy we put together to address that moving forward. I think we always see ourselves being successful when we get people to talk together. And I think because the languages are not mutually intelligible, you've got greater division than maybe you would elsewhere, say in Ukraine, where there's much more blending of the communities.
I touched just quickly on this issue in my comments, but you put your finger back on it, and it's an extremely difficult challenge for governments and for peoples today, because of the new nature of the information warfare. As I mentioned, even countries deeply anchored in Western institutions and freedom of speech are struggling with ISIS and whether to just take them off the air. You can't listen to that, right? I mean, these are serious new challenges that countries are struggling with all around the world, even Western countries. So I appreciate the complexity in a situation such as Ukraine. It's not a position we would support as journalists, taking other journalists off the air, but we appreciate the complexities of the situation in these different countries and the choices that get made. And based on the pernicious nature of so much of what's coming out of the Russian media outlets, I can appreciate and understand the frustration of people who just can't react to it, because the more you react to it, the more you can seem to play into that, to their game. As Paul indicated, you just become more of the noise. If they've put out 23 versions of what happened to MH17, your version, which happens to be the true one, just ends up being the 24th. So you're just adding more to the noise. It's not about truth and lies. It's about pushing the idea that there is no truth, as Peter Pomerantsev, who we all know very well. There is no truth. That's the idea. And it makes it very difficult to try to figure out how to respond to that and how to react to that in these environments. We have to keep talking about this. It's going to be a big challenge that's with us from here on out, I think.
Right here in the blue.
I can give you back this.
My name is Eva. I'm from Estonian Embassy, and I have some questions for Madam Nelja Sipova. And first, it is concerning the wording of your questions. First, what does it mean, Crimea joining Russia? That was it just really put in the same way? Because on the international arena, it is widely known that Crimea actually did not join Russia, that there is occupation in Crimea, and it was illegal annexation by Russia. So I think that if you asked this question in this way in Estonia, you could actually get quite many protests, and it could have been inflected also, the answers. And the next question is that actually how you answered that the number of interviewed people was 1,000. I also want to know that how did you guarantee that it was like you call representative entity? That how was the choice made? That it's not only that they were adults, but was it like the a choice made by their language spoken, by their age?
I'll explain.
How was this entity made?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so for those who understand Russian, I can read how the question was asked in Russian. Because the question was designed in Russian. And we did a very thorough job choosing the word. First of all, the word annexation was not appropriate because it really biased to one side. And we wanted to sound as neutral as possible because that's the main role of sociology. So the best way we came up was, вы поддерживаете или не поддерживаете факт присоединения Крыма к России? The word присоединение. You could translate it becoming part of Russia, but trust me, the annexation would push people to more than the word присоединение. So it's more like, but it's not like, it doesn't mean in Russian that it's voluntarily joined. That's what I try to say. Another point I want to make on this, even if you don't like our wording, the main point of this is not how many people support Crimea becoming part of Russia. The main point is that how this was affected by Western and Russian media. So even our percent would be, let's say, not 50% for country, but 40. The difference for effect would be the same. About how we choose people, this is a Gallup World Poll. We do it standard way from year to year for last 11 years. So it's random. It's a nationally representative sample. We have a certain procedure, and when we come to the household in face-to-face countries, we choose respondent based on Kirsch grid. When we put everybody in the household from oldest to youngest, or from youngest to oldest, who are older than 15, and we put on another line some particular number of questionnaire, and we pick a person. And we do not do any substitutes. So it has nothing to do with what language they speak or if they're main person in the household or not. So it's very random and it's bulletproof.
Okay. Next question. In the back, in the blue sweater.
Mitchell Pullman, I'm a contractor and I've spent a lot of time in the region for the OSCE, and I used to work in polling as well, and I also have some questions regarding methodology, kind of a two-part question. One is, as Mr. Trimble touched on, I would kind of like a clearer definition of when you say Western media, exactly what sort and types of media we're talking about. And also, did you, when you asked people about their consumption of Western media, were you asking people who actually use Western media? Because when I travel in the region, I find what we would call Western media just basically difficult to find. Even if you ask people, do you go on the internet to this particular website? Do you ever read the BBC? They never even think of it. So were your respondents people who actually watched Western media, or did they just not consume it because they were convinced by the Russian propaganda that all Western media is involved in this big anti-Russian propaganda campaign? I'm always having to tell people in the region that Russia and the whole post-Soviet space is absent from the American media. It basically doesn't exist, but they think our television networks are pumping out anti-Russian information all the time. So I'm wondering to what extent people consume Western media, if you measure that at all.
Yes, actually, can you show my third slide? I mean, we do have it there. And our question, we did not, in this particular study, we didn't go into depth, like in comparison with what BBG did when BBG asked about internet or TV. For us, it was use of Russian or Western media. So it could be any of above, right? And the same like you ask international media, it's similar, so it can be any. The difference probably in my mind, I don't know if you agree with me or not, the difference between, in Russian mind, between international media and Western media. Western may be too, actually more narrow, because international media can be Al Jazeera too. And it's not Western media. So it can be any media outlet from United States, Canada, or Europe. That's how people usually define. Because you see, it would be very hard for people. And again, we are focusing just on Crimea in this situation, right? It would be very hard for people to tell, okay, I trusted BBC, but I didn't trust to CNN. It's all blurry, right, in this case. So we, again, intentionally did it. You want to add something?
Yeah, and I think in terms of what we were looking at was trying to say media from outside of the country that was not Russian Federation. And the shorthand we've used for the presentation is international, but I would assume for Estonians it's going to be Finnish. For Moldovans who speak Romanian, it's going to be Romania. Of just sort of that outside. But because it wasn't a full media study, we don't have the consumption data. I mean, I don't have any of the next steps in terms of saying, you know, these people had these opinions and they're watching current time or they're not watching current time. It was really, we presented what we had. And so I think there's some interesting things to follow up on. But these are some of the challenges in terms of working with the data, is we don't have that same level of detail of specific channels that they watched and what is their idea of international. For us, it was interesting that it was non-Russian Federation, but what exactly that meant, I just have hypotheses on.
Let's take two more questions. I know we've got a hard stop for some folks. And then I know some of our panelists will also be here after the event, so if you want to come up after. Right here in the, yep.
Thank you very much. I'm George Mjedlishvili. I'm a Carnegie Visiting Scholar in the Georgetown University from the country of Georgia. So I really thank you very much for the presentation. One very short comment about banning Russia TV is like a follow-up to one of the recent interventions. In 2008, after Georgian-Russian war, the government banned Russia TV for several years. I myself had very negative attitude towards this because I obviously shared the opinion of my countrymen about the Georgian-Russian war and the resting Kaba territories, but I was really very, almost ballistic about this development, believing that it obviously curtails the freedom of speech. But we saw the figures today. So to what extent Georgia is different from most of post-Soviet countries in terms of its immunity towards Russian disinformation and Russian propaganda. So maybe we could use the term of information hygiene in this regard, knowing that Russian information is obviously kind of propaganda. And the results and the extent to which Georgians are pro-Western today might be, to a certain extent, be related to this event. Even though I know it's very cynical, I myself divided. It is wrong. It is undemocratic. But on the other hand, actually, it brought results. Obviously, the result would be similar anyway, even without banning, because obviously the Georgians shared the same experience. That's why for Georgians it was not vicarious. It was very alive
Sure, you have
experience.
a question.
And the question. So to Ms. Esipova, I was also surprised. It was counterintuitive probably for you as well when it turned out that people with higher education in many countries except for Russia tend to support Crimean annexation slightly more. So how can it be explained? It's really difficult because, well...
maybe someone will explain, but as I said, I was surprised completely and I could not understand why. Too, and we actually checked and rechecked data many times just to be sure that, but you saw it's consistent in all countries. So again, the only thing I can think of, but it doesn't mean I'm right, is that the depths, how it was presented, because for example, I've never heard in United States that people would talk a lot on TV about that Crimea was given by Khrushchev in 1954 to Ukraine, right? I mean, there were a lot of stuff put into explaining the situation, and I'm not telling if it's right or wrong, but it was definitely deeper. But if someone come up with better explanation, I would be grateful.
Okay, let's take one final question, and then I know some of our panelists can chat with you after. Right here in the blue shirt with a tie.
Thanks so much. TASS News Agency, Russia, Anatoly Bachinin. Thank you. My question is a follow-up to my Georgian colleague and to Ms. Cooper. Speaking generally, do you think that banning, prohibiting of Russian channels, it's a right thing, it's a fair method in this media warfare, how you call this? Thank you.
I think I've given the answer from my perspective as a journalist, as a career journalist, and that is that the banning of media outlets is not desirable. Having said that, we do have to appreciate that we're in a very different media environment in the 21st century, as I described, so I can appreciate and understand that individual countries and areas are making the decisions they feel that they need to make. But basically, if you believe in freedom of information, you believe in freedom of information, you need to keep fighting for that everywhere. That would be my perspective as a journalist on that.
General Ryan, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, having said that, I wish that U.S. international media would have the opportunity to distribute its content on Russian domestic media outlets that people use for news and information. We have a tiny little bit of access to the Russian media market through the Voice of America in partnership with the Russian Business Channel. Other than that, we're entirely frozen out of the market for distribution on television, which is far and away the most popular source of news and information. And I would sharply compare and contrast that with the situation of Russian media outlets operating in the United States and Western countries where they do so freely. I would like to have that same kind of access in the Russian Federation and that same kind of indication that there's a similar belief in free speech.
General Ryan, any final comments?
No, I think that's a great answer. I agree with it all.
Okay. All right, let's give one nice final round of applause to our presenters. Thank you all. We're adjourned.